Richard Florida's book, The Rise of the Creative Class, detailed how cities could add vibrancy by attracting the sort of younger, better educated workers who were in all sorts of creative fields to build more higher density, exciting sort of urban centers that would create jobs for people in the economy. Well, that's happened in many cities. We've seen it, of course, in San Francisco and in other areas that has really catered to the creatives. Of course, the downside of that is that property values have skyrocketed, making it very difficult for regular working people to live there. And it's also in many cases created a more homogeneous living environment in those cities. Richard Florida, who is university professor at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, is out with a new book, The New Urban Crisis, How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About it. Richard Florida, good to have you with us again on Air Talk.
Thanks for having me back. It's great to be with you.
So is it fair to say that, in a sense, cities have been victimized by the success of the kind of urban world you wrote about?
I think so. I think that, I lived through the old urban crisis. I grew up in Newark in the late 1950s and 1960s, saw that city explode into riots in 1967. Was graduating high school when New York was pronounced fiscally bankrupt, and our cities kind of hollowed out. Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, Cleveland, I could go on. And then, my own work, writing a decade and a half ago, I was really trying to trace the seeds of this urban revival. And, obviously cities like New York, that had occurred earlier, and perhaps areas of Boston and San Francisco. But in Los Angeles, just think about the incredible downtown revival that has occurred since really the year 2000. And according to the data we have, that's when the urban revival really gets going in high gear. But I don't think I could have predicted, nor do I think any mayors or urban leaders would have predicted the depth of this revival and how, as you exactly said, it brought people back, but it brought the young, the talented, the educated, the affluent, the knowledge workers, the creative class. And in this clustering of the arts, of technology, of knowledge, of startups, of people, it has driven real estate prices up. There's been this scramble for place and space. And the same force that's brought the revival, this clustering of talent, of energy, of people, of knowledge, ideas, arts, culture, technology, that same clustering of those things also has carved these incredible divides and this growing inequality in our society.
We see, for example, downtown Los Angeles, where Skid Row gets smaller and smaller, and the population of homeless people more and more concentrated in that area, more difficult for affordable housing to be found. And was this something that you had thought about when you analyzed it, or what were your thoughts, for example, about the poor people living in many of these cities? Where were you thinking they would go?
Well, I think I thought two things about it, to be quite candid. One, I thought following the late great Jane Jacobs, my idol and mentor, that our cities had been hollowed out. And for most of my life, people, industry jobs were moving to the suburbs. And I think, living at Pittsburgh at the time, a wonderful industrial city, teaching at Carnegie Mellon, seeing all of the technology and the talent we harnessed at Carnegie Mellon, leaving for places, your previous guest talked about the Bay Area, like Santa Clara, San Jose, San Francisco, Austin, Boston, and seeing my city at the time being hollowed out. I was hoping we would see an urban revival. I think I was really talking about this new group of younger people, talented people, knowledge worker, artists, cultural creatives, the so-called creative class, that were reviving cities. But at the same time, as early as 2003, and I want to be clear about this, as early as the year 2003, I wrote an essay for the Washington Monthly in which I did a pretty systematic comparison of my so-called, I'm making air quotes for those of you listening, my so-called creative class hotspots, San Francisco and Austin and Boston and all this, and the level of wage inequality. And I found a quite striking association well before the Occupy, well before the rise of the 1%, well before the rise of Thomas Piketty and his work. I saw a striking association between these creative class hotspots and the level of wage inequality. So I think I was aware of it, but I think I was still kind of naively optimistic that urban revival would somehow, begin to lift more boats, would somehow extend itself And really, to be quite honest, it wasn't the United States that woke me up. I moved to Toronto in 2007. You mentioned I'm a professor there. And I saw in a great bastion of progressive urbanism with a solid core that had been revitalized with arts and culture and technology and all of this, great universities in the city. I saw the rise of the crack mayor, this dysfunctional crack mayor, Rob Ford. And I think once I saw that, I said, if a progressive, you know what I'm saying, a city that a place provides health care and a social safety net and invests in people and doesn't have violent crime, if a Rob Ford populist backlash could arise in Toronto, more and worse would follow. Little did I know that the same kind of thing I was talking about would, God rest our souls, God save us, produce Trump. But I think that's what really woke me up, is that I saw this divide in Toronto.
I wonder if the other issue here is about technology, because the whole dilemma over increasing the minimum wage and closing, at least to some degree, the wage gap is the ability of businesses to automate so much of what it used to require people to do, and not just manufacturing, but even in the service economies, ways of increasing productivity with fewer people. And so you've got this dynamic tension between the potential of increasing wages, but also cutting jobs along the way. And I was wondering, is that something that you had contemplated as a part of this issue? Because I don't think it was as big a part of the conversation 15 years ago.
Well, I think this is one area that my work on the rise of the creative class, in a way, really anticipated. And, I guess living in Pittsburgh, and before that having a dad who was a factory worker in Newark, seeing his factory close, being a victim of deindustrialization, an eyeglass factory, be a victim of foreign competition and technology automation, I guess I saw that the manufacturing old middle-class jobs were declining, and this combination of technological change that you talk about and globalization of foreign competition was really bifurcating our economy. On the one hand, we had about a third of our workforce in these good, high-paying, knowledge, technology, professional, business, and creative jobs. On the other hand, we had nearly 50% of our workforce, 65 million Americans, participating in these low-wage, low-skill, precarious, and contingent jobs in retail, in food prep and service, and home health care, the low-wage service jobs. So I think I quite aptly talked about that and traced that. I think what's even more interesting is that these two kinds of people occupy separate geographies, that the creative class is ensconced in its neighborhoods, and I want to say not only in the city, in the suburbs, and the service class and the less advantaged, in fact, the less advantaged two-thirds of our economy, is ensconced in their separate geographies and separate worlds, and those two worlds increasingly are segregated and fractured and don't meet. The one thing that was really quite shocking to me is when I not only looked at the wages for folks listening in of these three groups. The creative class member probably makes 85 or 90 grand. The old blue collar worker probably makes 35 grand, and the service worker, is making less than 20 grand. What was terrifying to me is when I looked at what happens in a place like Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York to these wages when you take housing into account. The creative class worker, even with these expensive housing prices, still has 60 or 70 or in many cases 80,000 left over. But the blue collar and the service worker see their income destroyed. And, they have on average 15,000 or maybe 20,000. They can't live. And, that in that sense, they're just pushed into the older disadvantaged neighborhoods in the urban core, or they're pushed way out into the suburbs and the exurbs where they don't have a hope or prayer of getting back to work, getting into work. So it's really how this combination of low wages, if you will, produced by technology, and rising housing costs has really squeezed, in a terrible way, the old blue-collar working class, but even more so this new low-wage contingent service class.
Yet another example of how there's very little you get for nothing. It's always a trade-off, and the rise of America's creative class has created a significant flip side of that coin. We're talking with Richard Florida, influential writer on a number of issues related to urban America. His new book, The New Urban Crisis, How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. And it's that last, what we can do about it, his prescriptives we'll be getting to as we continue. It's Air Talk on 89.3 KPCC, back after a live update from Hetty Lynn Hurties. Pleasure to have you with us on Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. Coming up, Fresh Air with Terry Gross. Terry's guest today, Frank Rich, a former New York Times theater critic who also was a columnist at the paper, and executive producer of the HBO series Veep, satirizing American politics. Season 6 of Veep is underway. Frank Rich with Terry Gross on Fresh Air at noon right here on KPCC. Right now, we're talking with Richard Florida. His book, The Rise of the Creative Class, highly influential. He's written many articles and other books about the evolution of America's cities. His new book, The New Urban Crisis, looks at the flip side of the knowledge economy and the creatives who inhabit so many of America's cool cities today, places like Austin and Boston and San Francisco and the west side of Los Angeles. If you have questions for Richard Florida, we're at 866-893-KPCC, 866-893-5722, or the Air Talk page, kpcc.org. As he said earlier, downtown Los Angeles, a pretty clear example of the trade-offs that have come with the cities of America becoming more dynamic places. So, Richard, what is your sense of how this could shift? What are the changes structurally we could make to improve our cities?
Well, I think with the rise of Trump, we're going to get no help from the federal government. In fact, we're going to see this attack on sanctuary cities. We're going to see massive cutbacks. So in a way, cities and businesses and communities and foundations are going to have to do it on their own. And I just want to make this point about L.A. because you mentioned it. You know, we developed a new urban crisis index, which looks at housing costs, inequality, and economic segregation. It's not Austin that's at the top of the list. It's not the Bay Area that's at the top of the list. It's not New York. It's Los Angeles. Los Angeles, not only on its west side, but as you said, downtown, has seen this influx of creatives, of techies, of artists. It's the one place, you know, and I talk about this in the book, that has actually drawn creatives from New York. It's been a great success in urban revival, but we've seen this winner-take-all urbanism and this crisis of success. And when I look at it in the book, you know, it's no longer that we have the rich people in the suburbs and the poor people in the cities, and it's not like all the rich people have moved downtown. That middle class and the middle class neighborhoods have just been eviscerated. And you see it in Los Angeles. You know, you see the old middle class neighborhoods no longer exist, and you have concentrated areas of advantage on the West End and in Santa Monica and in Venice and then the Beverly Hills and Bel Airs, but also downtown. I call it a patchwork. You know, this idea that the city and suburb, it's a patchwork of advantage and disadvantage. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to build more. Obviously, we have to build more housing, especially where people want it. We have to build more affordable rental housing. Lord knows, God, in this country, in Los Angeles and New York and in San Francisco, we need more transit. We need more transit to get people to this, from the suburbs to the cities and from those disconnected areas. And we need high-speed rail. You know, you've had, and you're finally doing it in California, but we need high-speed rail so that we can connect our cities, so that areas that are more affordable outside these hubs of creativity. But all of this, and I think the most important thing is that we're just going to have to do it alone. And that's what's so daunting to me, is that at the time that maybe we need some federal help, we're not going to have it. And really, we have to wake up in the fact that whether it's Los Angeles or San Francisco or New York, we're going to have to really rebuild our cities on our own and take back power. And one of the things I talk about in the book is we're going to need to devolve power. You know, Americans of red and blue are convinced that Washington doesn't work. It's broken. The presidency is too powerful. We certainly see that with Trump in office, who can't handle the job. Why not bring power back to the cities? Let Los Angeles, San Francisco, which problems are different than Houston or Alabama, which problems are different than the Rust Belt, Chicago, and Cleveland. Let's figure out locally how best to solve our own problems, because there isn't any one size fits all. All of our cities and all of our areas have different problems.
So let's talk about housing, because one of the major obstacles here is people don't want high-density construction in the communities where they live, for the most part. They're very resistant to it for traffic concerns, noise issues, having large-scale projects in their neighborhood, blotting out the sky. So how do you convince people to accept the kinds of the amount of construction that would make any appreciable difference in housing costs?
So the first thing we have to understand is that there's a place for density and there's not a place for density. And it's not like every place has to look like Singapore or Hong Kong, and every neighborhood has to be transformed. There are certain places in the downtown core which are dense. There are certain places around subways and transit hubs where we should increase density. And And the backlash there from the left, I call not NIMBYism, not in my backyard. I call them the new urban Luddites. Because it's not just that they're prohibiting housing from being built. They're prohibiting the kind of so-called scaling, if you will, the growth of the city, that really this clustering of activity that is so important for innovation and high-tech startup. But on the other hand, in outlying areas where people want to live in a home, when they want to live in a residential or even a mixed-use suburb, a walkable suburb with a mixed-use downtown, that's okay. And I think one of the things, Joel Kotkin, who lives in Orange County, and he and I have been battling. I'm Mr. Urban, he's Mr. Suburban. We wrote an essay for the Daily Beast, and we said, you know what? We have to respect one another. If I want to live in an urban area and I want to live in a dense community, and about a third of Americans do, and I want to take a subway to work and have transit, I should be able to do that. But if I want to live a little further out in a walkable suburb, maybe transit served, but I want to have a patch of grass, I should do that too. I think one of the things that's only going to get us across this red-blue divide produced by the new urban crisis, produced by winner-take-all urbanism, and the difference between the LAs and New Yorks and San Franciscos and the rest of the country, well, you see the blue dots on the map, do your rocket scientists understand this, is that we have to respect each other. And certain of us love density and certain of us love suburbia. And we should be able to live the way we want. And the only way we're going to do that is if we're not afraid the other is going to impose their view on us, then in that case, empowering our cities and our communities to make their own decisions that respect the way we want to live, that allow people to vote with their feet, I think is the only way out of our economic and political divide.
Richard Florida with us, his new book, The New Urban Crisis, How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. Let me share some comments on the Air Talk page. Our phone lines are open for you at 866-893-KPCC to talk with Richard Florida, 866-893-5722. JSK writes on the page, concentrating economic activity into small geographic regions, especially given the political, regulatory, even real space obstacles to building a housing supply, transfers the value of the economic activity to the owners of real estate. So what good is it to have a good-paying job if vast amounts of it are going to housing costs? Anybody who was paying attention realized the massive opposition to building houses in California, especially in liberal parts of the state, which is why I argue, JSK writes, it was incompatible with the immigration agenda of the establishment. So we've got the economic benefits of having large numbers of people coming into the United States illegally, and here in Southern California, Richard Florida. But then you also have the accompanying stressor on schools and on housing matters. So how... And you've got a service economy here as well with people working who can't afford. So, we talk about the benefits of immigration, but there also are heavy prices that come with it. How do we realistically deal with that?
So the first part of that comment actually very accurately describes the new urban crisis. It's precious to my book, so thank you. I mean, you nailed it. This is the contradiction, this packing and clustering of people, which isn't a choice, saying that. It is literally the very structure. It is the structural force. It's not technology. It's not knowledge. It's not even human capital. This clustering of people and talent and technology is what drives economic growth. That's the basic underlying – our cities, in fact, in clustering are the basic platform of innovation and economic growth. But what happens is exactly as JSK says. As we pack people in there, Americans live on about 6% of our land area. And really, we're talking about less than a fraction of a percent of land in L.A. and San Francisco and New York and Boulder and Ann Arbor, whatever, that are really the economic generators, and the costs go up. That is the contradiction of the new urban crisis. But let's distinguish that from immigration. Literally all of the research on immigration shows that immigrants have been the lifeblood of this country, that high-skill immigrants have powered our high-tech industries. 30 to 50% of our high-tech industries, our patenting activity came from high-skill immigrants. And at the low-skill end of the equation, they're the people who staff our industries and make us more productive because immigrants, by virtue of the fact they move, are just ambitious and productive people. Yes, immigrants generate costs, but they cover they cover those costs. I guess my big fear is that when we conflate these two things, the new urban crisis and immigration, we put America at risk. And I think if we continue down this road of clamping down on immigration, I spend a lot of my time in Toronto Toronto and Vancouver are going to say, come up here. We have great universities and we have great cities. And why don't you come here? And why don't you bring your tech company instead of starting it in the United States or getting your graduate degree in artificial intelligence or computer? Or instead of coming to LA to work in the film industry, come to Vancouver, come to Toronto. And I do fear that if this continues for about 8 more years, if it's just a flash in the pan, a couple of years or 4 years will recover. If this anti-immigration, not only rhetoric, but reality continues, the United States will really throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. And I think these clusters of innovation, which have driven our growth, will begin to shift overseas. And I don't think Americans are ready for that. What will happen to our innovativeness, our entrepreneurship, our living standards won't be a good thing. So I think as we deal with the urban crisis, we've got to make sure that we remain steadfast as much as we can to keep our borders open.
We're talking with Richard Florida, the new urban crisis. We're at 866-893-KPCC or the Air Talk page, kpcc.org. Ralph in West Hollywood has a question about zoning issues. Ralph, go ahead.
Yes, Larry, it's my opinion that people densifying and in a city are not the problem. It's usually the cars. And I've always thought that creating zoning laws which prohibit the construction of parking spaces or garage space in dense housing projects would both provide a greater opportunity to build relatively low-cost housing and avoid the problem of traffic congestion in our cities. Yet, to the best of my knowledge, not a single city in the United States has implemented anything like that. And I wanted to know if your guest, Mr. Florida, had any insight into why.
I think we may have around transit projects here, an easing of parking requirements in consideration of the ability of people to take mass transit, but I'm not sure how much that's mitigated on those requirements. Richard, Florida, what have you seen around the country?
Well, you have the greatest expert right there in Los Angeles, and Donald Shoup, who was talking about this for the better part of decades, several decades. Get rid of the parking requirements, and the cars are taking up too much space, and they're ruining our cities. Look, I think New York, in a way, without that zoning requirement, has made it far less attractive to drive a car. When you're around New York, you see a lot of yellow cabs and a lot of black cars and some delivery vehicles. You don't see a lot of individuals driving cars, as they are in Los Angeles and Washington and Miami and my own Toronto. I think that's right. It frees up a lot of space. And our zoning laws, are handed down from us from the old industrial age, separating land uses, keeping industry away from commerce, away from residents, and really built for communities based on single-family, separate housing and cars. So we're now in a 21st century knowledge economy. We need density. We need clustering. We have to update our zone. And I don't think, I think there's another group of people who are saying if we just get rid of zoning, if we just do away with zoning and building restrictions, we'll be fine. I think that radical deregulationist argument also has holes in it because, as I point out in the book, which is very interesting, yes, L.A. is an epicenter of the new urban crisis. Yes, New York. Yes, San Francisco. But guess who comes in the next on the list? Houston, the epicenter, the exemplar of no zoning, build what you want. So it's not just an absence of zoning. You need the right kind of zoning, as the caller said, and the right kind of building codes that are up to date and encourage mixed use, limit parking, encourage density, and also protect neighborhoods so that people don't fear that their neighborhood's going to be changed in ways they don't want it to be. So I think it's a part of an argument we have to make, a conversation we have to have. And I think it's really fear. I've said this before. People are afraid that someone else is going to impose their view and their way of living on them. If people are saying, I can make my voice heard, I can protect my community in various ways, and maybe, as some people are, and maybe if they're compensated, somewhat compensated financially, and also if we have a land value tax, in which taxes scale go down as we build higher density. Maybe if we provide some incentives for this, as well as talking to people and including them, I think maybe we can make the shift.
Elizabeth in Fullerton, I'm running really short of town. Quickly tell us about the group you're starting.
I founded a YIMBY group for Orange County. We're called People for Housing. And my question for Mr. Florida is, we are well served by transit, and we are ripe to become one of those high-density urban walkable suburbs, at least around our transit area. My question for you is, what's your advice on fighting the baby boomer NIMBY.
Yeah, Elizabeth, thanks. We're almost out of time.
I call them the new urban Luddites. These are the people holding back not just housing construction, but everything she said about building a vibrant, innovative place around transit. And we just have to tackle that and go after that. And you know what? This isn't a left and right issue. It's an issue in which Democrats and Republicans can say we need to go at this together. But I think she's absolutely right.
And her group is what's called a YIMBY group. Yes, in my backyard. Thank you, Elizabeth. Richard, Florida, thank you so much for joining us again to talk about the new urban crisis.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure being with you.
Thanks so much. That's the name of his new book. He's author, of course, The Rise of the Creative Class. Have a terrific afternoon. Fresh Air with Terry Gross. Her guest, Frank Rich, next.